Welcome to the Afterspin, opinions from thought leaders in our state. I want to ask John Hood and Rob Schofield. Much of the national news for the last week or so has dealt with the retirement of Supreme Court Justice Kennedy. He was considered a conservative, but also a swing vote on human rights issues on the Supreme Court. My question is, how will Kennedy's retirement impact North Carolina? Rob?
I think we first have to say that it was one of the great political crimes of the 21st century that Merrick Garland is not on the Supreme Court, and that this would be a very different situation were he on the Supreme Court instead of Neil Gorsuch. Having said that, I think this is the great fear that many progressives have had for a long time. We are very concerned that Roe versus Wade, that Obergefell, the decision that gave same-sex marriage a constitutional authority, the Plyler v. Doe decision, which actually guarantees the right of undocumented immigrant children to attend public school. All of those, I think, are at least conceivably at risk now with presumably one of the people that Donald Trump will place on the Supreme Court. If progressives are unable to stop that, it could mean some really bad news for a lot of people in North Carolina, particularly the vulnerable.
We've heard a lot of the sky is falling kind of rhetoric concerning Kennedy's retirement. Specifically in North Carolina, how's that going to affect us? Rob talked about some of the specific cases.
Those are national things. I suspect none of that will happen, but if it did happen, it would affect North Carolina like every other state. It's just highly unlikely. What I think, though, is really significant for North Carolina is the attempt to use the courts to basically pressure the legislature or otherwise enact redistricting reform. There were some advocates of redistricting reform that pursued a litigation strategy going after partisan gerrymandering as a violation of the U.S. Constitution in a couple of ways. That was essentially all an attempt to get Anthony Kennedy, because they knew that there would be 4 justices with him and 4 against him, and Kennedy would be the swing. They didn't actually get him anyway. In the most recent decisions, if you read them closely, you could see Kennedy was unlikely to come over.
Didn't take the bait.
But it is very unlikely that the next justice will be as open to that idea. Now, that does not mean redistricting reform is a dead issue. It just means it's going to have to occur through convincing lawmakers, in this case Republicans. They don't have any guarantee of being in power in 2021, just like the Democrats thought 10 years before they were going to be in power forever. Republicans ought to take out an insurance policy against a catastrophic loss by having, let's say, a big Democratic wave in 2020, and they ought to do redistricting reform, put it on the ballot for 2020. I still think that's a viable argument, but I think Kennedy's retirement means it's the only argument. You don't have a legal strategy.
Are we going to see more legislation from the bench, essentially?
Well, I think that we're going to have a much more conservative court. I think that Neil Gorsuch will be one of the ideological driving forces on that court, and I think he wants to take this nation in a very different direction, and I think our country is going to look very different. I'm heartened to hear John say that he doesn't think that Roe versus Wade will be overturned, or that Plyler or Obergefell
would have voted to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Well,
I mean,
we'll see.
There could be additional restrictions on abortion or some additional changes, which have already been happening, but the actual throwing out of a long settled precedent like that, and frankly, in my view, this is not a long settled precedent, and I actually think there's a lot of questionable aspects to the way it was done, but the decision that gave same-sex marriage federal constitutional significance, I think that's unlikely to be just because people have built their lives. That's what stare decisis is about. People have built their lives around these decisions. So I think there will be changes on the margins. But this sort of ridiculous Teddy Kennedy style, the dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria kind of stuff, I just think it's not going to work, and it turns people off. It makes the people who make those arguments sound ludicrous rather than serious.
Well, I mean, you read what Neil Gorsuch writes. I mean, the man, of course he would vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, and so would Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito. The question is whether John Roberts will do it. I'm sure whoever
I was going to say, Roberts becomes the pivotal person on this court, does he not?
I think there's no doubt about that. And for progressives, that's
if they redid the Roe versus Wade arguments again, all that would happen is there would be changes in what states would be allowed to do. They would not be allowed to prohibit abortion entirely. Yeah. That's just not, it's just very unlikely.
Yeah, well, we don't know where the line is going to be drawn.
Well, we're going to take a few moments to ponder the dogs and cats business, and in the meantime, I want to thank you.
That is a reference to Ghostbusters for people who are culturally literate.
I want to thank you for watching the Afterspin. We'll have more video all during the week on ncspin.com.